Okay, in this video, we're going to look at the different economic systems and the ways that different countries decide how they're going to allocate their scarce resources. So basically, every country answers three basic economic questions: what and how much to produce, how to produce, and who to produce. That's what we talked about in the last video. So an economic system is essentially how countries determine how we allocate how they allocate their resources. So an economic system is a model which help us understand how countries go about allocating their resources. So essentially, different countries have different systems of ownership. We're from socialist, where the government owns most of the resources, to a capitalist system where the private market allocates most of the resources, to what we call mixed economies, where there's a mixture of both private and state ownership. So when we're looking at all countries face this decision about how they're going to allocate their scarce resources, how we're going to use our land, labour and capital to produce goods and services. But we need to make a choice about whether we're going to allow the government to determine how we do that, or it's going to be the decisions of consumers that allow what should happen. So some countries choose a more centrally planned system like the Soviet Union, where other countries determine a more private system. So essentially, there's four types of economic systems, but we're really only going to focus on two: market capitalism and planned socialism. That means that it's private ownership of resources, and the market, so demand and supply, determine what is produced, whereas planned socialism refers to when the government owns resources and they determine what is produced. It's up to them. There's also two that are sort of a mixture of both. So market socialism means that most things are owned by the government, but they still let demand and supply determine what is produced. And then you've got planned capitalism, where most things are owned privately, but the government steps in and tells businesses what to produce. So that might happen like during a war or something like that, where they're still privately owned products, but the government comes in and says, you need to produce this. Whereas market socialism is where the government wants to control most things and have the power over things, but they still let demand and supply determine what is produced, like your Sweden and things like that. Most countries are close to market capitalists now. So market capitalism is essentially when things are privately owned and demand and supply determine what is produced. There's limited government intervention, and it's essentially demand and supply that determines what we produce. Planned socialist means the government determines what is produced, and they own the majority of the resources. So capitalism, the government rarely intervenes. Um, the idea is that it's privately owned. People want to make a profit, so there's a high incentive to be productive and innovative. Wages are often unevenly distributed because it's all based on people's talents and contribution to the production process, and prices are determined by demand and supply. Communism, the government controls all aspects of society, so they assign people to jobs. Wages are determined by the government. Socialism, we'll talk about that a little bit more a bit later on, but the government owns most things, but there's a little bit less control over it than we would be with communism. So communism, I'll skip that, sorry. Planned socialism, the government owns most of the resources. The government determines how scarce resources are allocated. The state determines what's produced, and no one makes profit, so the aim of businesses isn't to make a profit. Prices are determined by the state. Quantities are determined by the state. People are allocated to jobs based on what the state or the government wants to achieve. Market capitalism, private ownership of resources, private ownership of the means of production. Consumers and producers determine what is produced, and people are free to produce what they want. The producers use their resources to maximize profits. When prices go up, that sends a signal for producers to produce more. And when prices go down, that's a signal to perhaps shift resources away from that industry. Okay, so capitalism, I won't go into that in too much detail, but there's some characteristics we'll talk about in later slides. Mixed economies is a bit of a mix of both. So where the government, most things are privately owned, but the government regulates certain things within the economy to ensure that some things aren't overproduced and some things aren't underproduced, which we'll talk about in a sec. But mixed economies is just a mixture of both. So command economies, as I said, resources are owned by the government. A central authority, which is the government, determines what is produced. There's also little competition. So the government's producing things, so there's not a lot of competition for goods and services. There's not an incentive to make a profit. People are generally assigned to jobs and have to meet certain quotas. So there's a certain amount they have to produce. So the aim is not to make a profit, but to meet the quotas which the government dictates. Consumers have very few choices, and the government sets prices. Market economies, the aim is to earn a profit, so decisions are made based on demand and supply. Resources are owned by individuals. Profit is the key word. Competition tries to keep prices down. and individual freedom is really important. People have an opportunity to start their own businesses, um, and have the opportunity to determine what is produced. Mixed economies combine both of them. So the government and individuals are combined in the production process. Um, the government will regulate to ensure that some products aren't overproduced and some things aren't underproduced. Um, in a mixed economy, the government also protects producers and consumers. So if producers are being unfair, and their practices are exploiting consumers, the government will also step in there to ensure that individuals aren't being exploited. Um, so, as terms of Australia, Australia is not a pure market economy, and demand and supply determines most of what is produced, but there is some government intervention. So, a pure market economy wouldn't have any government intervention in determining what is produced, where Australia has taxes, we have bans on certain products like alcohol and cigarettes. We also subsidise certain products like healthcare and education to make them cheaper. A pure market, total consumer sovereignty. So purely the government, purely the consumers determine what is produced, whereas the government steps in and doesn't allow for pure consumer sovereignty. Pure markets, there'd be total privatization of resources. Everything's owned by the private market. But as we know, in a country like Australia, a lot of things are provided by the government free of charge, like defence, emergency services, a lot of public goods, which wouldn't be provided without the government stepping in. In a pure market, resources are purely allocated based on price signals, whereas the government in Australia has some more say in sort of how we allocate resources. So, ensuring that certain people get access to welfare and public housing so they can afford basic goods and services. So, just a bit of a recap on sort of how capitalism has evolved, and we'll go through the part in the first video and partly in the second video. So capitalism in the early 19th century, so prior to the Industrial Revolution, there was just lots of little small businesses. So there wasn't any businesses that had shareholders or big companies. Most businesses were small. Investment and innovation, people tried to innovate, but there was very limited in terms of their money that they had. So it wasn't really until the second half of the 19th century that things really took off. Um, so developments in capitalism during the Industrial Revolution, there were technological advances and inventions which allowed for businesses to produce on a mass scale. That's the key thing here. The Industrial Revolution allowed for production on a mass scale. So things like the spinning jenny allowed businesses to produce products in sort of a quarter of the time, so they could mass produce, and then make profits by selling them to the rest of the world. Businesses also reinvested in new machines and infrastructure, which allowed them to increase their profits. So capitalism allowed people to become very wealthy following the Industrial Revolution. This was also the time the stock market was created. So people would invest in other companies, which allowed them to grow and become bigger because they'd get access to funds not just by borrowing, but also by allowing other people to invest in their companies. So businesses sold parts of their companies to shareholders, and everyone made money that was a shareholder if that company did well. We'll talk about problems with capitalism in the next